Welcome to the warm, cozy blanket channel. If you like what I do, give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. It really motivates me to keep reading more. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. So make yourselves comfortable and cozy, and I'll start my story. My most important lesson from the creature of the woods. My mother didn't love me. I don't blame her for it. It's hard to blame a stool for not having a backrest, right? If it had a backrest, it would be a chair. If my mother loved me, she wouldn't be my mother. At least she didn't have an abortion or abandon me at the maternity hospital. I was fed and clothed. And as for love, well, you can't command the heart. Maybe it was partly my fault. If I had been more affectionate with her, maybe she would have warmed up to me. But I too had always been somewhat emotionally reserved since childhood. My mother was an artist. She painted strange, abstract interweavings of polygons that made my head spin. And apparently, she was talented because she had several regular buyers, and we never lacked money. My father, it seems, was also from the creative circle, but my mother didn't like to talk about it, and I didn't insist. We lived in a 2-room apartment. In the larger room, my mother painted and slept, while the second room was formally mine. Formally, because I only slept there. My day went like this. I would wake up, my mother would feed me breakfast, give me money, and send me to school. After school, I would have lunch at the cafeteria, then go to the library and do my homework in the reading room, walk around the streets of my town, have dinner at the cafeteria again, walk some more, come home late in the evening, and go to bed. In winter, I spent more time in libraries. Later, I even joined a carpentry club. And in spring, autumn, and summer, outside. Being at home during the day was strongly discouraged by my mother, who did everything she could to drive me out. My room was just a place where I slept and where a wardrobe with my clothes stood. I wasn't allowed to have any personal belongings beyond what was necessary for school. One winter, I became friends with a group of peers. No special friendships developed with anyone, but playing together was fun. Once we dug out a cave in a large snowdrift together. The cave gradually expanded into a huge grotto, occupying almost the entire space within the snowdrift, with a roof reinforced by boards and a window covered with a piece of plexiglass. One of my companions even brought a small samovar-like stove. We lit it with wood shavings. It hummed, heated up, and our snow house became warm, even hot. And at that moment, I felt something strange that I hadn't felt before. Domestic coziness. No, not quite that. Just a faint shadow of that feeling, completely unfamiliar to me. And suddenly, I realized what I had to do. I had to build myself a house. I began saving on lunches. So by spring, I had lost some weight, but my pocket had become slightly heavier. As soon as the snow melted, I went to the hardware store, bought an axe, rope, several meters of polyethylene film, and some other small items, and headed to the forest. Whatever else there was around our town, there was certainly no shortage of forest. During summer vacations, I often visited it, sometimes alone, and sometimes with periodically appearing companions. I knew the trails more or less, so after considering a location not too far from the city, yet far from trails where I could avoid accidental people, I headed there, found a suitable spot, drove in a couple of stakes, and stretched the film between them. I climbed into the resulting tent, lay down on freshly picked grass. No, not that. Something more was needed to stir that feeling I experienced in the snow house. A tent is just a place to lie down. You can't stand up fully. It's not a home. I needed a structure where I could stand up straight and spread my arms. All summer, I built the house. First, I made a frame from aspen and birch trees as thick as my child's arm, and it turned out quite sturdy, despite this being my first construction experience. I covered the frame with polyethylene film, so it became something like a greenhouse, 2 by 3 meters. I didn't like it. First, it was stuffy. Second, the sun heated it up. And third, sitting in it felt like being in a transparent aquarium, uncomfortable. I decided to build more solidly. Somewhere about 2 kilometers from the construction site was a dump where, among other things, they threw away waste from a sawmill, including substandard slabs. Most of it was moldy or even rotten, but if you dug around, you could find quite acceptable boards. For transportation, I adapted a children's stroller found at the same dump, one end of the bundle of boards on it, the other on a strap over my shoulder. And off I went, first through a ravine, then through the forest with fallen trees, each time a different way so as not to trample a revealing path, across a stream, uphill, take a break, nail the boards in place, and off for a new batch. I managed to make 3 trips a day. Ah, the energy of youth. While construction was underway, I made an important discovery. It turns out that if instead of buying ready-made meals at the cafeteria and a couple of patties in dough for snacks, you buy, say, a bag of pasta and a can of herring in tomato sauce or stew or mackerel in oil or something else, cook the pasta in a large coffee can over a campfire, mix it together, and eat it. It turns out not only cheaper and tastier. No, really, it's tastier, right? But also somehow more homey cozy, as it were. Again, that ghostly feeling that I caught in the snow house, and which made me build this house. And tea. A pinch of the cheapest instant tea, brewed in a tin can, with 5 sugar cubes, with the smell of smoke to the chirping of birds. Nothing like in the cafeteria. And much cheaper too, so I began to have significantly more money left from what I was given for food. Somewhere in early August, the house wasn't completely finished yet. Though, looking ahead, I should say that I never stopped building it until the last day, constantly repairing, upgrading, expanding it. But it was ready enough to spend the night. There were already walls made of crooked, poor quality slabs, covered outside with pieces of roofing felt and burlap. Inside, thick cardboard from packing boxes. There was a roof covered with real, albeit old, asbestos cement sheets. There was a glazed window with only 1 crack. I was lucky. I found an inner frame with unbroken glass. Probably someone was repairing their country house. There was a lockable door on new hinges, purchased recently. and heavy. I miscalculated when I nailed it together from boards crosswise. The floor wasn't in the house yet. I laid it later, but there was already furniture. Some kind of bench daybed made from a couple of logs and boards, and a table made from 2 wooden crates nailed together. "Mom, can I stay overnight at Sergi's? We'll play video games and," I asked my mother. "Yes, yes, of course," she said with unmistakable joy. "And can I stay there tomorrow too? And the day after tomorrow, I'll come back." "Of course you can." That day, I spent almost all my saved money. In a sports goods store, I bought a sleeping bag. I was surprised how cheap it was. In a hardware store, a set of dishes, a couple of faceted glasses, a small aluminum kettle, a saucepan, a plate, spoons and forks. Bought several candles and batteries for a flashlight. LED flashlights had just started appearing. The incandescent bulb flashlight ate them up very quickly. Bought food for a couple of days. And most importantly, from my peer in that company, I hung out with in winter. Bought that very tiny samovar-like stove. I'm amazed myself at how much I managed to do that day. Ran around shops, stopped by for the stove, then moved all the new stuff. Spent a long time installing the stove. Its native pipe had burned through and was short, so I adapted another pipe about 10 centimeters in diameter. Found on the roadside, it seemed to be once a pole for a road sign. Then still had time to cut firewood and prepare dinner. I finished everything around midnight. Finished and finally realized how tired I was. I lay down on the daybed, wrapped myself in the unzipped sleeping bag, turned on my side, examining my house. Mine, only mine. Everything here is mine. Everything here I made exactly how I wanted. Suddenly, I felt a soft, warm push inside, as if a second heart started beating in my chest, pumping not blood, but pure happiness. That feeling of home coziness that had previously appeared to me only as a ghost, a hint, suddenly came in all its reality. God, how good. I stretched my tired, aching legs, and it seems began to doze off, and I felt someone's gaze on me. Not hostile, rather bored, almost indifferent, with just a tiny bit of curiosity. With such a gaze, I would look at an ant crawling along a blade of grass. And then this someone quietly said, "I want to ask a question. It's hard for me to explain." But I immediately felt how huge this observer was. Maybe taller than the tallest pine tree in this forest. Or maybe not taller. Maybe he was huge. Somehow deep. Like a small but massive black hole, with such gravity that time and space are tangled into incomprehensible knots. Was I scared? Well, to describe what I felt then, let me give an example from early childhood. I must have been about 8 or 9 years old in winter on a dark evening. I was walking down the street and suddenly heard the noise of a fierce fight around the corner of a house. I stopped, wanted to go back, but then a man walked out from around the corner. He was about 2 meters tall, with mighty shoulders, arms as thick as my neck, plus a thick, shaggy fur coat and a similarly shaggy Ushanka hat, which made him appear even bigger. His face was almost covered with a black beard up to his eyes, and his eyes showed recent adrenaline. His knuckles were scraped. He looked at me indifferently and walked past. Even back then, at that age, I intellectually understood that there was nothing particularly to fear. This guy had his own affairs, unclear to me, and I, an 8-year-old boy, was not his enemy. But one thing is sound reasoning in a safe place. Another thing is when someone capable of breaking your neck with 2 fingers is next to you. Something similar I felt now. I froze in my sleeping bag and felt myself covered with sticky, cold sweat. Who are you? I barely squeezed out. Just I, and that's it. Are you human? No, an indifferent, bored voice. Did I mention that I spent a lot of time in libraries? Among these libraries was one that local sectarians, either Jehovah's Witnesses or some evangelicals, favored and constantly slipped their literature onto bookshelves. And some of it happened to come my way just recently. Are you a demon? I've heard your stories about demons. A slight shadow of interest in the indifferent voice. No, I am not a demon. I suddenly realized that I had already asked several questions instead of answering, and I panicked that the voice's owner might get angry. What do you want to ask? Why did you build this house here? Is this your forest, huh? Sorry, I didn't know. At that moment, I imagined that I was talking to some fairy tale forest spirit, maybe a leshy or something like that. No, he answered somewhat confused, as if the thought that this forest belonged to him or not had never occurred to him before. So why did you build the house? People live in apartments, in cities. They build houses in villages, where other people are. Why did you build this house here? Because, and I told him everything. About how I have a room in the apartment, but there I can only sleep. That once we built a snow house in winter, and I liked it there. And so I decided to make my own, so that, everything would be mine, everything as I want, so it would be cozy, so there would be a place to sit, a place to lie down, so it would be my own home. I was afraid that this unknown forest spirit would tell me to leave his forest, and I would lose my newly acquired home. So perhaps I slightly overdid it with emotions, trying to move him. I would have run away from this creature, flashing my heels, and abandoned any valuables. But my pitiful hut was dearer to me than anything I had before. When I finished speaking, he left without commenting on my story. At some point, I simply felt that I was talking to emptiness. Of course, sleep disappeared without a trace, so I got up, lit a candle, started the stove, and drank tea until morning. In the morning, I wanted to go home, but then I imagined how my mother would grimace, to whom I said I was leaving for 2 days, and since nothing terrible had happened anymore, I stayed anyway. I slept half the day, then had lunch, went to the dump a couple of times for boards, had dinner, slept, had breakfast, started laying the floor in the hut, had lunch, went for boards, continued laying the floor, and worked a bit on the roof. And so 2 days flew by. The next 3 years, I spent a lot of time in this hut, practically living there. I only ran to the apartment to eat, get money from my mother for food, and sleep over a couple of times a week. My mother didn't care. I suspect if I hadn't returned one day, she wouldn't have noticed for a month. I could tell a lot about those happy 3 years when I had a house. A lot happened. It would make a thick book. Alas, I am not Daniel Defoe and probably couldn't write interestingly about how I built the house, how I lived there, what tools I bought, how I set up lighting from an old car battery, how I made a field shower, how I camouflaged it. Also, alas, I am not Vladislav Krapovin and couldn't coherently tell how once I got a friend, how I showed him my hut, revealed my most intimate secret, and how he spat in my soul, and how he repented afterward, and how we both regretted that broken friendship couldn't be restored. It would be a thick book, and probably an interesting one, but I still want to tell about something else, about that strange being that spoke to me in that forest. The next time I heard it 2 weeks after our night conversation, when I had almost convinced myself that it had been a dream. I was walking from the city to the hut along the trail when suddenly the bodiless voice spoke directly into my ear. "Don't go there today. Wait until tomorrow." I froze like I was rooted to the spot. I stood there, thought about it, turned around, and went back to the apartment. The very next morning, continuing along the trail, I saw traces of a drunken picnic. A large fire pit, about 3 vodka bottles, remains of shashlik, a pile of papers and cans, and several used condoms hanging on branches. Who knows what would have happened if I had stumbled upon them yesterday? Maybe nothing, but maybe they would have pestered me, taken my backpack, or just for fun hit me in the face. Another time, already in autumn, I went deeper into the forest picking mushrooms, looking down at my feet, when suddenly I heard rustling in the bushes about 15 meters from me. I raised my eyes and saw a bear. Lord, how huge he was. I remembered reading in books that when meeting a bear, you shouldn't run away. Instead, you should stand still and shout loudly. What standing still? What shouting? I bolted away like I was stung, tried to shout, but fear choked my throat. I came to my senses only near the hut. I pressed my back against the wall, listened. Isn't the bear chasing me? Don't I hear the heavy body breaking through the bushes? Seems like no, it's quiet. And in the silence, I heard laughter. Yes, that's right. The unknown forest spirit was laughing. What are you afraid of? He said condescendingly. You're not needed by him. The bear came here to eat raspberries, but there aren't many raspberries here, and they don't taste good. Soon he will leave and won't return. I don't know how he knew these details. Maybe he read the bear's thoughts, or maybe he just asked and the bear answered. But somehow I completely understood that he wasn't lying. And I calmed down. And there was another incident in winter. Winter came late that year. First, there was a long, warm, and dry autumn. Then finally it got cold, snow fell, even at night, the temperature didn't drop below -15 degrees Celsius. I continued going to my hut overnight. The thickness of the walls was sufficient for such temperatures, and the small stove gave enough heat, except that I had to sleep in spurts, fell asleep, woke up because it got colder, added wood, slept again. I got used to it quickly and slept well. That winter day, I arrived late. Well, late for winter. It got dark earlier. I was delayed at school, and a lot of snow had fallen, and I didn't take skis, so the journey took longer, and I reached the hut when it was almost dark. I checked the supply of firewood stacked in the entrance hall. I had set up something like a vestibule of poles and polyethylene near the door, discovered that there was little wood, but waved it off. It's already dark, I'll save it. It will last until dawn. Then I'll cut more. I lit the stove, economizing as planned, closed the draft slightly so it would burn slower, waited until the air warmed up, took off my outer clothes, and flopped onto the daybed with a book. Oh, I completely forgot to mention, I had a whole library. Or rather, at that time there wasn't one yet. There was only one book, but later I assembled a whole homemade bookshelf. In our libraries, when it was time to discard books, they were placed on a special table where anyone could take them, better than throwing them away. Sometimes I left the library with a full bag. I read interesting books, uninteresting ones. Well, paper always comes in handy in the forest for kindling and various things. Oh, if only I had that bookshelf full of books that winter night, it probably wouldn't have survived. I lay there, reading by the light of a tiny bulb powered by a battery, when suddenly I felt that it had gotten colder. I checked the stove. The wood hadn't burned out yet. I slightly opened the damper so it would burn more intensely and returned to reading. But for some reason, it didn't get warmer. I opened the draft fully. The stove roared, warmth blew, but the wood burned out completely in minutes. I went out to the vestibule for more, but as soon as I slightly opened the door, I almost choked from the frosty air. I put on my jacket, a light jacket comfortable at -10 in the city, but not comfortable in the middle of a night forest at -30, or whatever the temperature dropped to that night. Grabbed an armful of wood, dragged it inside, and slammed the door. I loaded the wood into the stove. It almost went out from the frozen sawn sticks, but eventually caught fire, and wrapped myself in the sleeping bag. Outside, the wind blew, not in gusts, but quite strong and steady, unceasing. There were no noticeable drafts after all. I had carefully stuffed the gaps, but the thin walls froze instantly. Frost even appeared in some corners. Damn, even in the snow house where that very stove once stood, the walls held heat better. The reader has probably already wondered, don't you have more clothes? Did you really walk into the forest, build a house, cut wood, and stoke the stove in the same jacket you wore to school? Did you stain it with resin, smoke it with soot, tear it on branches? Well, yes and no. The thought of getting extra clothes came to me in summer, after the first resin stain on my jeans, and in autumn, I picked up a work coat of nauseatingly gray color that a school shop teacher threw away due to wear. This teacher was skinny, but quite tall, so the coat's hem reached almost to my ankles. I sewed up the holes, reattached the torn pockets, tightened the fabric on the sleeves with a few stitches so they wouldn't flap, and wore it like a cloak. In winter, I loosened the tightened parts on the sleeves and wore it directly over my jacket. It protected from resin, branches, and smoke, but unfortunately added little warmth. Suddenly, I found myself in absolutely no mood for laughter. As soon as the fire in the stove weakened, the temperature began to drop. The wood burned quickly, and the supply was small, and I realized that if I didn't find something to fill the stove with by morning, I would at least catch a serious cold. I threw the last armful of wood into the stove, took the handsaw, put on the coat over my jacket, and went outside. I looked around, illuminating myself with a flashlight. A moonless winter night, dark. Of course, near the hut, I had already felled all the deadwood suitable for my saw and broken off all the dry branches I could reach during summer. I would have to walk along the trail, then turn into the forest, push through the fir trees, go down into the ravine there, and there were still quite a few not too thick dry pines. At night, on a cold night, the frosty air took my breath away. The wind burned my face, penetrated through the coat and jacket, and something howled in the distance, probably the wind whistling, but who knows? I thought about it and returned to the hut, having only sawn off the protruding top of a small fir tree. It was wet, but with hardened resin streaks, so it caught fire somehow, though it cracked and smoked. My gaze fell on the stool. Perfect. Homemade, nailed from thick sticks, massive and dry, made back in summer. Just what I needed. I sawed it up, shoved the logs into the stove. What else? The table too, made from crates, thin planks, but they would do as well. And the daybed. There's plenty of wood in it. It will last a long time. And for how long? What does long time mean? Until morning, definitely. Even until noon the next day if I economize. But will it get warmer then? Mother thinks I'm spending the night at Sergi's, playing dandy and eating his grandmother's pies. And Sergi doesn't even know that we're best friends. How I lie to my mother. And no one, absolutely no one will come looking for me. And suddenly I felt so sorry for myself, so homeless, that I cried, whined like a little child. And the next second, something outside cracked and collapsed, so that the ground shook. I rushed outside and was stunned. A huge dry spruce, twice the width of my skinny body, had fallen right at the door of my hut. Just a little to the side, and it would have crushed me along with the hut, like a cockroach in a matchbox. Fell from the frost, probably, I thought. They write in books that trees crack from frost. Probably they can fall too. What luck. The fall shook all the snow from the branches, so it wasn't difficult for me to saw thick, resinous branches for the whole night ahead in several trips. I stuffed the stove with wood, fully opened the damper so that the stove roared, and one of its sides glowed crimson and finally relaxed. The next day the temperature rose to acceptable levels, so I had no problem running to the city, although I was slightly chilled. I didn't stop visiting the hut, but I learned a lesson from this story. Bought thick cotton pants at a second-hand store, a shaggy synthetic fur coat, worn out and therefore cheap, and winter boots with thick insoles. I bought the boots at a fishing store. They were surprisingly cheap. Moreover, I insulated the hut with available means, covered the walls in several layers with roofing felt, rotten plywood, burlap, everything I could dig out from under the snow at the dump. The hut looked quite hobo-like from the outside, and in my new old clothes, I looked like a hobo too. But now, I wasn't afraid of the cold. Well, of course, I didn't forget about heating. I promised myself to install a new, more powerful stove at the first opportunity, and began stocking up on firewood, namely, cutting down the conveniently fallen tree. And here I discovered that the tree hadn't fallen from the cold. It wasn't broken or split. It was neatly cut. Not a single splinter sticking out. A shiny, polished cut, as if not hard, dry wood, but soft grass had been cut with a brand new razor blade. I stood there with my mouth open in amazement, then whispered, "Thank you." One might get the impression that the forest spirit was taking care of me, that we had developed something like friendly relations. No, not at all. We talked once at night. Once he helped me avoid an unpleasant encounter. Once he laughed at my fright. Once he brought me firewood. All this happened only in the first few months, and I spent 3 years in my hut, noticing his presence only a couple of times during all that time, feeling something huge nearby, which, however, could have been my imagination. Let's say he was like an adult neighbor from another entrance in a multi-story building, with whom I exchanged a few words while taking out the trash a couple of times, and who once drove away the hooligans who attacked me. No more. Life flowed as usual. I studied, grew up, built my hut, made friends, quarreled, fell in love, suffered from a broken heart, learned to smoke. What's the point of elaborating? Life is just life. The end of the 11th grade was approaching. I decided to apply to a university in a not-too-distant city. It was naturally assumed that I would live in a dormitory and wouldn't bother my mother with visits, and even better, quickly find work, permanent housing, and settle there. That's basically how it turned out. I got in without problems, found a good part-time job in the first month, which soon turned into a good permanent job. My mother sent money at first. The dormitory didn't cause much discomfort. Even with 3 roommates, it was still my own room. Compared to the empty room in my native apartment, it was heaven and earth. And my roommates turned out to be nice guys. I didn't miss my mother, not the apartment, not my hometown, only my forest house. It wouldn't be much of an exaggeration to say that I went to bed and woke up thinking about it. I often planned to take off on weekends, visit, check if it was still there. But somehow, it never worked out. Either there was too much studying, or a profitable job came up, or romantic affairs. I wanted to visit it during winter holidays, already prepared to buy a ticket, but realized that I didn't have suitable shoes or skis, and the ones I had at home my mother probably already threw away. Only in spring, shortly before exams, I finally came to my town, and immediately from the station, headed to the forest. I walked along the familiar trail, turned at my secret spot, walked a little, and suddenly saw a clearing in the forest that hadn't been there before. A wide logging clearance ran through the forest. Heavy logging trucks had rutted tracks, cut logs were piled up, and heaps of chopped branches lined it. And right where my hut once stood, a considerable pit, already starting to fill with water. I sat on the first log I came across, dropped my backpack, pressed my head with my palms. Probably I'll cry now, I thought, but to my surprise, I didn't cry. Probably this is how it should have been. I grew up, and this hut was part of my childhood. It's silly to cry about a lost childhood. It's silly for an adult to have a secret house in the forest. That's for teenagers. I'll have another house, now a real one, not this toy hut, right? Number, I immediately answered myself. There will never be another such house. Sighing, I got up from the log, slung my backpack, and went back to the station without even stopping by my mother. A few days later, staying up late studying, I finally turned off the desk lamp and lay down in bed while my roommates were already asleep. I was tired, but sleep wouldn't come to me. Someone upstairs was packing in their room. Floorboards creaked, just like in my forest house. I wonder how surprised the loggers were when they stumbled upon it. There were a bunch of things there: tools, clothes, a shelf with worn-out books, some canned food, a bottle of vodka, heh. But why did they demolish it completely? They needed a pit there to dig sand or gravel. They could have done it 10 meters further, and they could have rested in the hut themselves. It wouldn't have been too cramped even for adults. Well, no use thinking about it now. And suddenly, I felt the familiar gaze upon me. The gaze of an invisible, bodiless, but so huge being. Are you here?" I whispered to the night darkness. "Yes," he replied. "What do you want?" "I came to thank you." What?" I didn't understand. "I came to thank you. When you came to the forest and started building a house, I became curious. I observed you. I asked why you built the house, and you explained it to me. And then I decided to try it myself." "What? Try it myself?" "Try building a house myself." One of my roommates muttered in his sleep, tossed around, but didn't wake up. Maybe he didn't hear my interlocutor. Maybe only I could hear him. And suddenly, his voice changed. The board note disappeared, and was that inspiration? I always traveled, moved around. I thought people built houses because they were cold and scared. I'm never cold and have nothing to fear. I had no need for a house. But you explained to me why you need a house, and I decided to try building my own. I built it there where I am. It's not like yours, it's different. It has walls outside, a roof above, and things inside. Yes, many things. And when I return to it, I feel cozy. This confession made me feel a bit scared, but at the same time warm inside. Such an alien being, and he too had found a home. perhaps it would be appropriate to end the story here. It would be a good story about how a lost teenager met a forest spirit and taught him something human. But no, the story doesn't end here. My house is gone, I sighed. The forest was cut down, it was demolished. Your house is intact. My invisible interlocutor replied. When they started cutting the forest, I moved it to where I am. What? I was surprised. Where to where? He didn't answer my question. Instead, he said, "Now I want to thank you, to give you a gift. Hold out your left hand." Why the left? I thought, but pulled my hand out from under the blanket and extended it into the darkness, cupping it and expecting some gift to fall into it. I felt a slight, thin pain in my wrist, as if I had cut myself with a thread. The room suddenly smelled strongly of blood. I grabbed the place where my left hand had just been with my right hand and screamed. There was commotion, frightened roommates, ambulance, police. Ah yes, back then it was still militia. They never found my left hand. To all questions, I answered that I was sleeping. Didn't see or hear anything. Woke up from the pain. Didn't quarrel with anyone. Didn't notice any suspicious persons. So the militia eventually concluded that some unknown madman sneaked into the dormitory past the watchman, opened the locked door, chopped off my hand either with a very sharp axe or a very big and also very sharp knife, ran out, locked the door behind him, and left the dormitory before the commotion began. Not the worst version, actually. No worse than the version that the forest spirit took my hand in gratitude for inspiring him to build a house. Why did he do it? I thought long and fruitlessly. After all, specifically the left hand. Maybe I had some deadly nail cancer and he sensed it and decided to save me. Or maybe he can see the future and I was destined to fail my exams, get expelled from university, get drafted into the army and die there. And he decided to make me disabled, and thus once, and for all terminate my relationship with the military registration office. However, I didn't fail my exams. On the contrary, I passed quickly and got all A's. The professors probably felt sorry for me because of my hand. Or maybe I wasn't so stupid. No wonder I spent my childhood in libraries. The last of my roommates, a C student and slacker, passed his last makeup exam and went home for the summer, leaving me alone in the dorm room. On the entire floor, only I and one more student from the penultimate year remained, a former orphanage kid who also had nowhere to go. We each got a bottle of beer, settled on a wide windowsill, and spent the evening in pleasant conversation. I returned to the room, locked the door, lay down in bed on top of the blanket, fully dressed. I didn't feel like sleeping. Just from the beer, a relaxed state came over me, and I decided to lie down with my eyes closed. The stump healed quickly and hardly hurt. None of those phantom pains doctors warned about. But still, just in case, I crossed my hands on my chest so that if I dozed off, I wouldn't accidentally press on it. Just like in a sleeping bag, I remembered that That's how I used to sleep. And suddenly, I felt that I wasn't lying on a sagging dorm bed, but on hard boards, and it didn't smell like peeling wallpaper, packet soup, and my dirty socks, but of spruce resin, smoke from the stove, and damp earth. I opened my eyes and saw the asbestos cement roof of my forest house above me. I jumped up from the daybed, looked around. Yes, there's no mistake, I'm in it. The same walls covered with packaging cardboard, the stove with a rusty pipe, the bookshelf with books swollen from high humidity, the table made from crates, and on the table, purely reflexively, I raised my hands to rub my eyes that didn't believe what they saw, and discovered that my left hand was in place. I spread my fingers, clenched them into a fist, wiggled them. Everything was as it should be. But what shouldn't have been there was what lay on the table. My severed left hand with a puddle of blood underneath it. How is this? It's both there and here. And how did I even get here? I muttered to myself, squinted my eyes, opened them again, and found myself back in the dormitory. Getting up, I walked around the room, nervously rubbing the stump, where just moments before there had been so realistically. Was it a dream? My hand. No, it wasn't a dream. Gradually, I began to realize what exactly the forest spirit had gifted me. I took several deep breaths to gather courage, lay down on the bed, and closed my eyes. And everything repeated itself. Many years have passed since then. I've grown up, got married, have a daughter. My daughter has her own room where she arranged everything as she wanted, and I never enter without knocking. I built a house, a cozy cottage on the outskirts of the city. My wife and daughter love it very much, and so do I, but still, I have only one real home. Wherever I am, as soon as I lie down, close my eyes, and remember it, I find myself there. Time has stopped there. My hand still lies on the table. The puddle of blood under it hasn't even darkened. And there I'm always 18 years old as when I lost my hand. I sit on the daybed, reading through the worn-out books from the homemade bookshelf for the 100th time. Sometimes I light the stove, not for warmth. It's not cold there, just for coziness. The firewood never runs out. Every time I return, it's always in place, and I've already memorized every log. Sometimes I go outside the hut. The forest surrounds it, about 10 meters around the hut, on the site where the pit remained. Further, only flat desert of lifeless gray sand. I don't like looking up. The sky there is ugly dim. The sun isn't visible, and the clouds for some reason form nauseating patterns, resembling abstract paintings of my mother. And about 100 meters away stands another house. It's not like mine, it's different. It has walls outside, a roof above, and apparently things inside. But I don't want to know what, because even a distant glance at this house makes me tremble. Once I approached this house a little closer. "Hello," said the voice. "Hello," I replied. "Thank you, it was a great gift."